But the only reason that they would do this is because they were concerned, the bank in particular, about suspicious activity, about potentially fraudulent activity, but also about the provenance of specific funds going in and going out of that bank account.
The Sunday Times, as you've heard on this programme, have discovered that Reform UK's bank account was frozen during the last election. It's after the party received potentially illegal donations from the mother of George Cottrell, the convicted criminal who bankrolled Nigel Farage. It's the latest revelation from the Sunday Times Insight team. It's their investigation about how Reform and its leader are funded. Now, when approached by Insight, Reform said this story follows a number of smear stories, of which many are factually untrue. Mr Farage has decided to let the voters of Clacton be the judge of his actions. Well, joining us now is Dr Sam Power, who's an expert in electoral regulation at the University of Bristol. Good morning, Sam.
Morning, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Can you explain to us what are the rules when you've got a political party about who can send them money?
So the rules are incredibly complex as it relates to political financing, but actually in many areas they're relatively simple. And in this case, what we have is a big list which is publicly available on the Electoral Commission website about permissible and impermissible donors. And permissible donors, if you will, those people that you are allowed to accept money from, are effectively businesses, individuals, trade unions, but anyone based in the UK or that can vote in the UK. And that also means that if you are registered as an overseas elector, for example, you can also donate. And that's Christopher Harborne. So he lives in Thailand, can vote in the UK, so he is permissible.
And so when you read the investigation here from the Sunday Times about the fact that the party had their bank account frozen for 2 weeks, the paper says here that is unprecedented. The decision to freeze the account of a political party has no known precedent in modern times. How unusual? It's obviously very unusual. Why would a bank do that?
Yeah, so I was racking my brain as well for any examples of this. And the closest you can get is in 2004, Barclays simply, I suppose, debanked, to use a phrase, refused to hold BNP, British National Party, bank accounts. But that was in response to undercover exposés about racism, and they just didn't want to be associated with the British National Party. In terms of freezing bank accounts, and in this particular case, it's due to suspicious activity. That is quite right. It is unprecedented in modern times. Our electoral law in this case only really goes back to the year 2000, so it's actually quite hard to measure. But the only reason that they would do this is because they were concerned, the bank in particular, about suspicious activity, about potentially fraudulent activity, but also about the provenance of specific funds going in and going out of that bank account.
Yeah, so what the Sunday Times says, bear with me while I just read this out because I think it's important for clarity, that in May of 2024, Cottrell's mother gave £500,000 to the party in her own name. The next month, she gave a further £1 million to a company owned by Richard Tice, who then Richard Tice donated half of that sum to Reform. And in February last year, the Metropolitan Police began a criminal investigation into the payments she made on the basis that she may have disguised the source of the donations, and that inquiry continues. Does that seem to you, Sam, to be sort of the source of part of the problem here?
I mean, that seems to be precisely the issue. So we talk about the complexity of electoral law, but let's talk about the donors in this case. Okay, Fiona Cottrell, a permissible donor. Richard Tice and his business holdings, permissible donors. So these donations in and of themselves not necessarily a problem. George Cottrell, an impermissible donor because he is not registered to vote and lives abroad. So the concern, I think, and the exact reasoning behind not just perhaps the freezing of the bank accounts, but the police investigations, is whether the money that came from Fiona Cottrell and therefore Richard Tice's business holdings actually came from them or was given to them by George Cottrell. And in that instance, that is a breach of electoral law. What you cannot do is take money from an impermissible donor and give that money to a political party, you being a permissible donor. This has happened once in the history of electoral law. In 2023, person called Gary Clacton was given a suspended sentence because he had essentially hidden donations from somebody else and given them to the Conservative MP, David McIntosh. So this is the exact thing that the police will be looking at, whether the donations in this instance came from Fiona Cottrell or indeed Richard Tice's business interests, or whether they were given by an impermissible donor. And importantly, whether Fiona Cottrell and indeed Richard Tice, as the owner of this business, were aware of this arrangement.
OK, so those are sort of the unanswered questions, really, that the police are looking at, and I'm sure the Sunday Times Insight team as well. Sam, what are the consequences of a breach of electoral law?
So it can be anything from a fine, and frankly not a very big one at that, given the sums of money that slosh around when it comes to donating money to politics, or indeed a prison sentence of up to a year. In the case of Gary Platt that I just mentioned, and the donations to David McIntosh, this was about £10,000, so piddling sums, frankly, as compared to what we're talking about here. He was given a suspended sentence.
How problematic are these ongoing investigations for reform?
So there's two ways to view how they are problematic. I mean, there is this sort of wider existential question, I suppose, of how problematic they are as it relates to our system of democracy, right? We have designed, actually, as it relates comparatively with the rest of the world, quite a permissive system in which we do not put a cap on donations. We have very open rules as it relates to who can give money to a political party. But the sort of trade-off with that is that people play by those relatively permissive rules. And if they don't, then not only does it raise questions about who gets a say in our democracy and who doesn't, but it also raises questions about whether those rules need to be fairly significantly tightened up if they are this easy to circumvent. The other question is how bad is it for reform, frankly? And I think what Nigel Farage and many people in reform would like you to believe is that this is some kind of establishment stitch-up and that the voters simply don't care. But what we know from the Makerfield by-election in particular is that when voters were given messaging about Christopher Harborne's donation, for example, and then Reform's relatively friendly policies as it relates to cryptocurrency, for example, that really did affect whether people would vote for Reform or not. It actually reduced people's voting intention by 4 points. So I think the problem for Reform is that these stories simply are not going away, and perhaps the voters of Clacton, when given a straight choice between a man dressed as a bin and Nigel Farage, might back Nigel Farage. But the question is whether this is actually affecting the Reform vote across the country, which is much more important.
Yeah.
Sam, it's Nick Wallis here. I've been listening to your conversation. I wonder if we could go back to first principles, because I've been trying to get my head round this. Let's say I was a millionaire and I really like Rosie, and I thought I'll give Rosie £500,000 because I'm a nice person and I like her. And then Rosie decides that she wants to support Reform UK and give £250,000 to Reform UK. If I'm an impermissible donor, but my money was not a gift to give to Reform, is there a problem with that?
Short answer, no.
So this is about intent then, isn't it?
It's precisely about intent. And this is what I mean when I say that electoral law is very complex, but it's very permissive and it is very easy to comply with if you know what you're doing. My favourite quote about electoral law is it's like a Jane Austen style dance. There's lots of tricks that you need to learn and there's lots of things that you need to do. You can start looking very, very foolish very, very quickly if you don't know what you're doing. But if you do, you can find your way around pretty easily. And actually, unless there is a very clear paper trail, which frankly says, in any case, hypothetically, let's talk in your case, I'm going to give Rosie £1 million, and actually I would quite like some of that money to go to the Sam Power Party. You're very unlikely to get caught out there. If you just give Rosie £1 million, she is free to spend that money however you might wish. There might be a nod and a wink and a nudge, and we suspect that goes on quite a lot with this, but you really do need a paper trail to prove the intent.
Sam, thank you very much for your time. It's been really useful having the context. That's Dr. Sam Power, lecturer in political and electoral regulation at the University of Bristol, speaking there about also what's going to happen in Clacton, which Nigel Farage Reform said. This story follows a number of smear stories, many of which are factually untrue. Mr. Farage has decided to let the voters of Clacton be the judge of his actions. When I have spent time in Clacton, I was there when Nigel Farage won the election in 2024. I was there a couple of weeks ago after he announced the by-election. I'm going back next week.
Oh, you love it. You can't get enough of Clacton.
Many residents do say exactly, they echo the words we hear from Nigel Farage. They say this is a stitch-up, and these stories actually only then solidify their support of Nigel Farage. They feel like this is proof of a media stitch-up. It's the establishment against Nigel Farage, and you do hear that firsthand. We have got to do something now because we've talked about the Clacton by-election. It is, I'm afraid, not just Nigel Farage against a bin, as we just heard from Sam. There are many candidates, and bear with us for the next minute or so because we've got to tell you all of them who are running. So let's kick-start then.
Joseph, 77, Independent.
Adnam Alkip, the Forward Party.
The aforementioned Count Binface from the Count Binface Party.
Nick, the Incredible Flying Brick, the official Monster Raving Loony Party.
Tony Kane, Independent.
Woke Trump Kazi, Independent.
William Stewart James Clouston, Social Democratic Party.
Rees Cowan, Independent.
Glenn Charles Cummings, Independent.
Martin Davies, Freedom Alliance, Real People, Real Alternative.
This is a legal requirement, by the way, in case you think we've gone mad. Andy Earlham, Independent.
Nigel Farage, Reform UK.
Ati Fard, Independent.
Lawrence Fox, the Reclaim Party.
Tony Francis, Independent.
Robin Green, Independent.
Abby Hookway, Independent.
Howling Lord Hope, the official Monster Raving Loony Party.
Stephen Richard Ingram, Independent.
Amy Morris, Independent.
Derek Norbert Morris, Independent.
Michael Noah Keefe, Independent.
Martin O'Brien, Independent.
Nick Peles, Independent.
Ketan Kumar Pipalia, UK Voice Safer and Stronger UK.
Daniel Pocock, Independent.
James Ransley, Consensus Party candidate.
Jerry Smith, Independent.
Kai Stevens, British Democrats.
John Stevens, Rejoin EU.
Baron von Thunderclap, again from the official Monster Raving Loony Party.
Pamela Watford, Independent.
And Marcus White, Everyone is God Party.